Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the 2023 Administrative Law and Governance Colloquium on the legitimacy of the state. I'm Paul Daly, University Research Chair in Administrative Law and Governance at the University of Ottawa. The topic is legitimacy for this year's colloquium because the legitimacy of contemporary liberal democratic states is in a state of flux. Managing the effects of globalization, responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and fighting escalating inflation have prompted serious questions about public administration in the global north. These pressing issues have shone a spotlight on difficult areas for liberal democracies, which have struggled in recent decades to reconcile popular desires with the need for effective governance. In this year's colloquium, speakers will address and have been addressing challenges to legitimacy in liberal democratic states by focusing on a range of institutions, the executive branch, administrative agencies, immigration enforcement, central banks, and today, the civil service. The overall goal of the series is to outline contemporary legitimacy challenges and likely responses. Today's guest is Professor Joseph Heath, professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto. His research interests include social and political philosophy, business ethics, moral philosophy, and distributive justice. Publications include Morality, Competition, and the Firm, Following the Rules, Filthy Lucre, Communicative Action and Rational Choice, and The Efficient Society. And today's topic is his book, The Machinery of Government, Public Administration and the Liberal State, published 2020 by Oxford University Press. It is a fantastic, thought-provoking and provocative book. And I'm very pleased that Professor Heath can join us to discuss it. Professor Heath is going to speak for about 25-30 minutes, and after that, as ever, there will be a question and answer session. If something pops into your head as he is speaking, you can pop your question into the Q&A box, and if he doesn't respond to it, I will make sure that he does. Professor Heath, it's wonderful to have you. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. So I guess I'll preface this by emphasizing that so I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy, so I'm a political philosopher, and one of the things about political philosophy is that is that we haven't actually thought very much and very seriously about the administrative state and about the executive branch of government. And so this book is an attempt to think through it a little bit. It comes from teaching a course in the School of Public Policy at the University of Toronto. So I was invited to teach about 15 years ago an Ethics of Public Administration course, which and a lot of the book was developed over the course of teaching that course. But in teaching at the School of Public Policy, one of the things I found was that I wound up interacting with a lot of former and present civil servants. And getting to know civil servants and listening to them tell their war stories about how they did their jobs and so forth really impressed upon me the extent to which in contemporary political philosophy we simply haven't grappled seriously enough with the question of public administration and in particular the role that the permanent civil service plays in the exercise of state power. And so everybody sort of knows, like everybody in my line of work, if you tell them that, the Weberian picture whereby the people elect leaders and the leaders formulate policy and then they hand the policy off to bureaucrats who then implement it. Everybody knows that that's not an accurate representation of how a complex modern democratic state works. But then everybody sort of brackets that away and sticks it in a box and then seems not to integrate it into their reflections about the state, and in particular their normative reflections on the state. And so what I wanted to do in the book is sort of, broach that question about what the power of the executive is and how it can be legitimate from the standpoint of contemporary political philosophy. So I should say, so there's a big empirical literature on this, but there's a really, really impoverished normative literature on this question. So if you look at what we do in political philosophy, I'd say 75% of the energy is spent focusing on the legislature and on democracy, and then maybe 20% on the judiciary. And then less than 5% certainly on the executive. And so that's the overall goal of the book then, was to sort of talk about the executive and to think about the contribution it makes to the success of the welfare state. So then what is the obvious problem posed by the executive is well summarized by John Rohr, one of the few books, sort of classics in the ethics of public administration. And the problem is simply that the bureaucrat, in a certain way, shares power with elected officials, and yet, of course, is not democratically elected. And so then the question, I mean, that obviously poses a challenge and a problem in a democratic society, because then the question becomes, what is the basis of the legitimacy, or what is of the power exercised by the bureaucrat? I should mention then that just a little sort of complication is in the book. So when I talk about the executive, what I'm interested in now, it's the case that in a parliamentary system, technically it is the case that the highest echelons of the executive are elected simply because members of cabinet are technically members of the executive and are by convention always elected. And so actually, when I talk about the executive, what I'm interested in is everybody below the level of the cabinet minister, so the DM and lower. In other words, I'm interested in what we call the permanent civil service. There's an enormous number of complexities. One of the reasons why this field is underdeveloped, I should mention, is the fact that the Anglosphere is divided between parliamentary and presidential systems, and the issues in the United States are in many ways radically different from the issues in Canada. And the election of the presidency casts a sort of huge shadow over the way in which people think about the power of the executive in the American system. And then the Convention of Civil Service Neutrality creates a completely different arrangement in parliamentary systems and in Canada. So one of the reasons is it's hard to talk across the Anglo-American divide when it comes to these questions. So I'm going to be kind of running a roughshod over certain distinctions, but also for the most part focusing on parliamentary systems. All right, so what I'm interested in, well, and so one of the motivations originally for the project was to encourage the civil service to get beyond the slogan that they often use to articulate the contribution they make to policy, which is this sort of fearless advice, loyal implementation as a slogan. And the problem with this sort of fearless advice, loyal implementation, I mean, loyal implementation is good. The problem with that particular formulation, though, is that the civil service exercises a great deal more than just advice giving. It does a lot more than just give advice. So the phrase that I use to express this is the idea that they actually have administrative power. And so I'm interested then in the power that actually originates within the executive. And I think that there are at least three elements to a power. So beyond just simply giving advice to people with power, the executive wields its own power. And so that power takes three primary forms. The first is that they have an enormous amount of discretion in how they go about their work. So this is like widely recognized, is that policy gets formulated at an extremely abstract level and then gets passed down and becomes marginally less abstract as it moves its way down through the bureaucracy, but that a huge amount of work gets done specifying policy. And by the way, I should mention, I would put under the category of discretion also the operations of administrative tribunals. Administrative tribunals are also, in my world, wildly under-theorized. In the sense that most people in political philosophy and in political theory and political science departments have just simply not thought at all about administrative tribunals, despite the fact that there's thousands of them. And so obviously they're more of an issue in the legal theory literature. But in political philosophy, they're hugely under-theorized, what they're doing and where they derive their power from, and et cetera, and the problems that they raise also. Then the second thing is policy entrepreneurship, which is that a lot of policy originates in the civil service. I have tons of examples of it in the book. In Canada, I like to think of Canada's radon gas strategy as a classic example of policy entrepreneurship, because the issue of radon gas in residential dwellings is one that has never risen to the level of political whatever. It's never showed up on the radar as far as I can see. There's never been a newspaper article about it. There's never been a political debate about it, whatever. It's just below the threshold of interest of the democratic public sphere. And I can't recall a single instance of a politician ever discussing explicitly the problem of radon gas in public. And yet there's been a whole complex policy initiative undertaken in order to reduce exposure to radon gas, which is the second most significant cause of lung cancer in Canada. So that has been undertaken entirely by people within the executive branch of government, right? So the example of policy entrepreneurship. And then finally, there's the fact that members of the civil service in some ways exercise political power. And there are a variety of ways in which they do that, but that is that they have the capacity to pressure politicians in various ways, both through internal channels and also through external channels. So then the question is how all of this power is being wielded. And the simple answer is to say, well, we would hope at least that it be done in a way that advances the public interest. And that formulation, which is itself uncontroversial, raises a huge number of questions and problems, though, because you say, I mean, everyone can agree the public interest, but then the question becomes, how do you determine where the public interest lies? And normally we say, well, it's democratic contestation. It's democracy, which is the procedure, which is supposed to generate the conception of the public interest. And that gets you back into thinking then that public administrations should simply be subordinate to elected officials. But if you have these sort of vast regions of discretion where politicians have like no interest and no capacity to exercise any kind of oversight, and therefore you have the executive developing its own independent conception of where the public interest lies in order to advance policy, then the question becomes, well, where are the principles coming from that they're using to decide where the public interest lies? All right, so then the question is, and how do you relate that then to the democratic principle and to the suggestion that the exercise of state power should always be democratically legitimate? And then finally, there's a special problem that arises within Westminster style parliamentary systems, which is then if there's an independently specified conception of the public interest within the civil service, how do you reconcile that with the convention of civil service neutrality? And I agree with my former colleague Lawrence Sosden in saying that convention should rightly be regarded as a constitutional convention, namely that it's an extraordinarily important structuring feature of our political system, civil service neutrality, but that there's an obvious tension between the civil service having its own conception of the public interest and then that obligation to neutrality. Okay, so in the book, I sort of run through quickly. I think I might, maybe I'll go through it like, well, maybe I'll blast through a little bit quickly today. I mean, one of the things I try to do in the book is just in an introductory fashion, just to emphasize how much the civil service does and how much we take for granted its operations. And a situation in which we didn't have a bureaucracy guided by its own conception of the public interest would like severely impair the quality of the public sector. And would diminish the sort of achieved level of civilization, but also of social justice in our society. So the civil service makes enormous number of contributions that are often just sort of overlooked or taken for granted. And so I sort of do an overview of them, although you could probably add a lot to the list. Right. So the first is the sort of keeping the show on the road, which is just sort of keeping things going. In circumstances in which there isn't a government. I mean, this is less of a big deal in Canada, but think of a country like Belgium, where they often go years at a time with having literally no government because they have a proportional representation system and no one has a majority. So there's just like no government. So it's not just that you have to keep, like the health system working and stuff like that. It's that you still have to conduct foreign policy. You still have to do policy development. Like everything can't just stop, the day Parliament gets prorogued or what have you. So that's an obvious feature of the civil service. Second is long-term planning. I think it's somewhat underappreciated the extent to which the concern about fiscal sustainability in the civil service. I mean, that's an issue on which the civil service feels fairly strongly that it's in a position to push back against elected officials. And so, like, if you look in political philosophy literature and say public choice theory, the prediction is that elected officials, given that they're only interested in getting votes and being reelected, are going to have an extremely short planning horizon. But if you look at the real world, what you discover is that states vary in the extent to which they worry about the future, but that they don't do nearly as badly as, let's say, public choice analysis would lead you to expect. And then the question is, well, why? And one of the answers is that the civil service actually has a strong commitment to long-term sustainability of government operations. Then there's a matter of just consistency, which is that politicians often have a tendency to oversteer, and of course you get radical changes in the ideological character of government and so forth. So that the civil service functions as kind of ballast, which then politicians are constantly complaining about not being able to get things done quickly enough and so forth. But obviously that has an important function as well at making it more difficult for the government to lurch back and forth between contradictory policy options. The civil service has way better information. I mean, this is something, again, it's often underappreciated, the extent to which courts just don't have the personnel and legislators don't have the personnel to actually do in-depth policy analysis on a lot of different questions. So they just, I mean, one of the major reasons that courts defer to tribunals is because courts can't actually gather the information that's required and so forth. But also legislators are often like, sort of functioning in the dark. That is that they really don't have adequate resources to get good information. The civil service, as we know, is like teeming with analysts who could be sent off to study this and study that and so on, right? And again, the stories you get told, by former civil servants are like, oh, that they, when you say like, how did this happen? How did this policy get implemented? And they say, well, we started out, we got up some funds, we hired a couple of analysts, we started working on the question, and over the course of like 10 years, we put together like an analysis of this. Before then, we acted on it. Right, so that's the kind of like, it's not just the long-term game that they're playing. It's the capacity to invest significant resources in developing information, developing ties with civil society groups and university groups and so forth. Then finally, there's this is kind of related, but you've got an emerging culture of evidence-based policy analysis within the civil service that is obviously far more rigorous than either other branch of government is interested in doing. So even, for example, like the use of randomized control trials in policy initiatives, stuff like that, that's the kind of thing you're only ever going to get coming out of the executive branch. This is somewhat underappreciated, but you often, some former civil servants often describe scenarios in which they found themselves acting as sort of the lawyer for society, namely that they're the ones in the room who are not beholden to any particular interests. And in Canada, for example, I think that like people on the outside underestimate the extent to which geographical interests, for example, strongly skew the decisions of elected officials. Right, so our political system is one which highly rewards the highly concentrated regional interests, and politicians are often beholden to those regional interests. And so the question is like, who speaks for the public in a deliberation that's going on, like as in Canadians generally, and it's often the civil service who winds up playing that role. Somewhat related to this, but a bit different, is that they also have the capacity to resist a pandering, and so politicians again are like highly reactive to like what's in the newspaper. So if you look at the way healthcare resource allocation works, for example, there's certain kinds of headlines that politicians don't like to see, right? Which is like highly sympathetic and tragic, a person who's being denied therapy by the healthcare system, right? There's a huge impulse to want to then respond to that, but in ways that can generate really irrational and inconsistent planning. Again, the civil service, being unelected, has the capacity to resist that. And then finally, this is also, I think, underappreciated, is the extent to which the civil service is the big check on legislation in order to ensure its constitutionality. And so, again, in my line of work, we focus an enormous amount on the role that courts play in the review of legislation. But the civil service plays a huge role in making it the case that unconstitutional legislation becomes less likely to see the light of day. And a lot of that's obviously just done by the Justice Department. But in Canada, like the whole question of charter-proofness, right, gets consistently and always raised by the civil service. And it's not something that politicians are necessarily aware of. All right, so that was just kind of like a list of things the civil service does. Now, and again, you could expand the list. Now, if you were just a sort of consequentialist about political philosophy, so if you thought that institutions are good to the extent that they produce good outcomes, then it wouldn't be hard to justify then the power that the civil service has, because you can simply point to a lot of good outcomes that result from the civil service having this power. I, however, am not a consequentialist when it comes to political philosophy, and neither are sort of the majority of people in my business. So we all subscribe to a kind of deontological liberal framework where we think that there are certain kinds of principles that constrain the exercise of state power above and beyond just getting good results. And so then that creates a a sort of a problem when it comes then to justifying this power, because like I said, it's a power which is wielded by unelected officials. And not just unelected officials, it's often counter-majoritarian in effects. In other words, it's often a countervailing power to the power of elected officials. And then the question becomes how you justify that in the context of a democratic polity. Now, so my basic strategy for answering that question starts with this sort of idea that struck me very forcefully reading Boo Rothstein's work. There's a whole bunch of it, but in particular his book, The Quality of Government, where he draws, and this is something that's come up in Europe as well, he draws sort of a useful distinction between what he calls input legitimacy and output legitimacy of the system. This has been a big issue in the EU. We could talk about this if you want in the Q&A if you want. Because the EU consistently lacks sort of input legitimacy. So input side of the political system is basically how rules and regulations get formulated. So it's like formal democracy. And the output side of the political system are basically the performances of the state. And so what the state accomplishes, like how well it runs the healthcare system, the education system, and so on and so forth. And the thing that Rothstein points out, which I think is a really useful observation, is that intellectuals think about this very abstractly and therefore put an enormous amount of emphasis on the input side of things, and which is part of the reason we worry so much and think so much about democracy, and also the way in which laws get formulated. Whereas the average citizen, actually, the input side of it all is an abstraction in the pejorative sense. Like that is, every 4 years they go and vote, and they don't see like a very close feedback relationship between what they do in the ballot box and then what actually happens down the road. Whereas on the output side of things, they interact directly with state officials, with police officers, with teachers in their child's school, with the person behind the desk at the Ministry of Transportation and so forth, right? And the attitude that they form towards the state is predominantly governed by the quality of the interactions that they have on the output side of things, right? That is, with members of the executive branch. And what Rothstein wants to emphasize. I mean, so I remember reading this when I read. I read this. I was living in Toronto, and during the period in which Rob Ford was mayor, and it solved sort of a puzzle for me, which was that at the time, so Rob Ford had a very unfortunate addiction to crack cocaine, and was barely sort of functioning as the mayor, and that he would be photographed at 3 a.m. completely drunk on a bender at some bar, and then he would call in sick the next day, and so like all the mayor's business would be canceled and stuff like that, right? And yet he had this kind of rock solid base of support of about 40% of the electorate. So there was this kind of Rob Ford paradox of like, the way I formulated it was, I thought, like, here's the mayor has obviously got like really serious substance abuse problems, and a huge percentage of the population don't have any problems at all with him continuing as mayor and would vote for him again. Now, suppose like the principal of your child's school had the same kinds of problems, right? Where like, the principal was like on a bender at night and was so high that he couldn't wake up in the morning and open up the school, and so like school was canceled for the day or something like that. Like absolutely no parent would tolerate that kind of behavior in the principal of their child's school. And yet a large section of the population was willing to tolerate it in the mayor of the city. So the question becomes why? And then the answer is, well, like, what does the mayor do, right? Like, that's really abstract what the mayor does. Whereas what does the principal of your child's school do? That's the kind of direct face-to-face interaction that individuals have with the state. And that's the level at which they care about the performance of the state. So that I thought was a really good insight. And then Rothstein's second point, and this is the more challenging one to argue, though, is to say that the way the state performs on the output side is also important to the legitimacy of the state. And so people judge the sort of validity of public law and whether or not they have a duty to comply with it, in part based on a sort of independent conception of what the job of the government is, and whether or not the government is actually discharging those obligations. And so we should think about political legitimacy more broadly than just in terms of democratic legitimacy. Democratic legitimacy focuses on the input side, whereas there's this other kind of legitimacy that's yet to be specified that occurs on the output side. So that's what I want to develop. And that's what I try to develop over the course of the book. So let me just say something quickly about what I conceive the major barriers to the development of that view to be. Okay, so there are two major objections to this idea that, I mean, what I'm saying in effect is that it's actually okay for the executive to exercise administrative power. There are two, in more or less the way it currently does exercise power. There are two major objections to that. The first is obviously the democratic objection that I've already been mentioning. That's the most intuitive, which is that they're unelected and not necessarily accountable to elected officials. The second, though, is this one's a little more sort of recherche that it took me a while to grasp, but that is actually a big deal for a lot of people, particularly in law, is a liberal objection, which is that it violates the separation of powers. And that, so I've just been reading Philip Hamburger's book on administrative law being unjust and so on, right? You can see like that's the concern for a certain brand of conservative critic, right? Is that the rise of the administrative state is unconstitutional in the sense that it violates separation of powers, and that's a huge problem. Now that objection is really different actually from the democratic objection, but they both constitute serious obstacles to the argument that I want to develop. So I'm going to say something really rough about what my approach is, but I want to first mention that that there's not a lot of literature on this subject, but there is some literature on this subject. And so Pierre Rosa-Vallon has written a series of 4 books in which he actually tackles exactly this problem. So the 4 books are Counter Democracy, Democratic Legitimacy, The Society of Equals, and then finally Good Government, right? So they're all translated in English, but obviously written in French. So his solution to this problem, so he sort of picks up exactly the same problem that I'm worried about. And then the question is, how do you justify the power of the executive? And then his answer is to say, is to want to expand the concept of democracy to make it broad enough that the administrative power can also be seen as a component of a democratic system. Right? In other words, so what Rosa-Vallon wants to say is that where we make a mistake is in thinking that the natural home of democratic legitimacy is in the legislature. And so the power of the judiciary and of the executive are problematic to the extent that they're not democratic, right? So we often think of them as counter-majoritarian or undemocratic or something like that. So then the question is, how do these other 2 branches of government relate to the legislature? Because the legislature has the democratic legitimacy, right? So that's the classic problem. And the way Rosa-Vallon wants to solve it is to say that's not true. The legislature actually doesn't have a monopoly on democratic legitimacy. Democracy, rather, is a distributed system, namely that it's the operation of all of these different branches of government together and elements of civil society and civil society organizations that constitute a democratic polity. So the legislature, he argues, is the institutional embodiment of what he calls the majority principle. But the majority principle is not the democratic principle, right? So he's kind of an unreconstructed Rousseauian. He says the democratic principle is that of the general will. And the general and majority rule is not, actually, he claims quite radically, doesn't have any principle of justification vis-a-vis the democratic principle. And so majority rule is like so the legislature is the home of majority rule. Majority rule has the problem, though, that it only reflects the majority, and therefore you have a problem of minorities. And as a result, you have a huge number of other institutions that are put in place in order to stop majorities from kind of presuming to represent the general will, and therefore running roughshod over minorities. And so the first book, Counter Democracy, is the way in which, like the tendency of the French public to go on strike, for example, acts as a check on the power of majorities. And so that's the idea of counter democracy, is all these other veto points that exist in society are a part of the democratic system. Right, so like a naked majority actually lacks democratic legitimacy, but that majority, when it has to overcome all these other hurdles, then acquires democratic legitimacy. And so that's sort of it's a really neat and provocative argument, but I think it sort of goes nowhere. But what he wants to say about the executive is that the executive contributes a few things to the legitimacy of the state that the legislature is unable to generate. So the first, and this is also, I mean, this is a correct and interesting observation, is that we underestimate the extent to which the public hates partisanship, right? So one of the things about democratic politics is it becomes completely dominated by partisan politics, to the point where if you listen, I mean, there are very few politicians who are able to speak publicly without sounding like they have a kind of mental neurosis around partisanship, right? Which is that the way they speak is this kind of ritual invocation of warfare against the opposition party and so on. And the public like really dislikes that. So if you look at public attitudes towards elements of the state, they often want things to be done in a non-partisan way because they don't believe that partisans are capable of actually, like reflecting upon and advancing the public interest, right? That they're locked into pursuing their own partisan interests. And so the legislature winds up being just contaminated by partisanship, and as a result winds up discrediting itself in the eyes of the public, right? And you can see that, I mean, overwhelmingly in the United States, but you can see it in Canada clearly with, for example, the extent to which people want like parliamentary officers to solve various problems. So people want the Auditor General to come in and fix, or they want like the ethics officer to come in and say, I mean, the reason why there's such public enthusiasm for these officers, they often underperform with respect to it, is that what people are craving is a kind of impartiality and a focus on the public interest, as opposed to the partisan conflict that they see every day. So that's, I think, kind of interesting and an astute observation. And then the last one is just a legitimacy that comes from efficacy, which is just being able to solve problems. And that's also something that people expect from the state as a sort of reflection of the general will. All right, so I mean, so that's the ones I have an overview, and I think it's a kind of like I lay it out there because I think it's like a totally plausible way of approaching the problem. Right, so it's not the one that I adopt, but I think it's the obvious alternative to the view that I'm defending. Right, is to try to have this more capacious concept of democracy that includes the executive. So he gets into trouble with it. I won't get into the details of why I think he's wrong, right? But that's the alternative to my own view. So my approach to the question, and I'm going to wrap up with this, is to keep democracy confined to the legislature. So instead of trying to spread out democracy to include both the judiciary and the executive, what I want to do is keep democracy focused on elected officials, but say that we don't live in an illiberal democracy or a regime of unrestricted popular sovereignty, but rather we live in a liberal democracy, right? And then what liberalism represents are essentially a set of constraints on the choices made by democratic publics, in part also due to limitations of majority rule as a decision-making procedure. So everybody's very familiar with the idea that courts act on certain kinds of independent liberal principles, right? So some people try to indirectly justify the power of courts through reference to democracy. The more standard strategy is to think that there's a certain set of rights that get articulated, or core political principles, constitutional principles, what have you, right, that have a kind of independent normative authority. And that then the court represents the liberal principle in conflict sometimes with the legislature, which represents the democratic principle, and a liberal democratic society is one in which, like out of the tension between these two principles, we wind up with something approximating a good polity. And so I want to endorse that, but want to argue that the executive also acts on the basis of liberal principles and derives independent authority from certain liberal norms. But in order to do that, I have to kind of give an account of liberalism that thinks of it much more broadly and abstractly than in terms of the kind of limited schedule of rights that we're familiar with in modern constitutionalism. And so there's a kind of, very philosophical segment of the book where I have a kind of defense of what I call modern liberalism, which is, bears a suspicious resemblance to the philosophy of John Rawls, right? Which attempts to reconceptualize liberalism in terms of very abstract principles that satisfy a neutrality constraint. Not a political neutrality constraint, but rather a kind of neutrality vis-a-vis rival conceptions of the good. And so what I argue is that modern liberal states are animated by three major principles. First of all, a principle of efficiency, understood in the sense of Pareto, right? Which is that we try to achieve systems of cooperation where possible. And then I spent a lot of the book arguing that that's actually like the overwhelmingly most important principle in a modern liberal state. Then second, there's a principle of equality, which in terms of the civil service gets articulated primarily in terms of the constraints associated with the rule of law, understood in a kind of law and fuller sense, like not in an old classical liberal sense. And then finally, the one that kind of gets ignored the most is the sort of principle of individual autonomy and liberty that gets interpreted in terms of a non-paternalism constraint. So anyhow, so that's the overall argument of the book, which is that the power of the executive can be justified by the contribution it makes to the legitimacy of the state. That contribution consists in its capacity to advance certain kinds of liberal principles. And those liberal principles don't have a democratic grounding. They often exist in a kind of productive tension with the democratic principle that's embodied in the legislature. And so it's different from the contribution made by the courts, but it's in a sense similar to it in that it has an independent normative grounding. Okay, so I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Heath, for that excellent introduction. And I think you can see now, those of you who are listening in, why this is such a thought-provoking and interesting book. There is one question that popped up in the Q&A as you were talking, and it is an important question. When you talk about the civil service, are you referring to the entirety of the public service or working level, e.g. senior management appointed by cabinet, and potentially less neutral or free of impact on their employment for resisting elected officials? So answer that, and then I have another question for you about administrative tribunals and independent administrative agencies.
Yeah, so the general bias of it is in the direction of senior civil service, because you get the in terms of the administrative power construct, and obviously that becomes more significant when you have, you know, sort of DM level civil servants who've got like 20-year careers and know all the ins and outs of how government works and so on and so forth, right? So they wind up wielding, so the problem posed by individuals like that is often the most severe. Right, so they wield a huge amount of power. And then the question is how it is exactly that they're wielding that power. But there are certain areas of government, though, in which lower level civil servants, or like, you know, like government employees, actually also also exercise a huge amount of discretion and have a huge amount of power. And so, like, I don't think that the person who works behind the desk at a Service Ontario center is particularly interesting and wields a huge amount of, like, it doesn't wield a form of administrative power that's kind of like interesting from the standpoint of political philosophy, or problematic from the standpoint of political philosophy. But I think, for example, police officers do, right? So police officers are street level bureaucrats, but they have like really high levels of discretion, and also clearly use that discretion to pursue a wide range of extra statutory objectives, right? And have their own conception of of how they're doing their job and what they're trying to do and so forth, right? So I think they're really interesting. So anyhow, so I mean, what guides the interest is not like a prior demarcation of who the class of employees are that I want to speak about. What I'm interested in are the public officials who have like an enormous amount of discretionary power. And then the question is what principles inform their deliberations when they think about how to exercise that power.
And that, I guess, applies equally to an administrative agency like the CRTC, say, or the Canada Energy Regulator, or the Ontario Energy Board.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the, yeah, I mean, I mentioned at one point in the book, like one of the sort of strange perversities of the whole new public management initiative is that that on the one hand, you know, so when Thatcher initially sort of pioneered these efforts to reform the civil service, it was based on this on the, you know, what is a fairly consistent complaint of conservative governments, which is that they you know, think the civil service won't do what they're told, right? And so they feel as though the civil service is either directly insubordinate or else, you know, just kind of like passively resistant to their efforts. And so you have this kind of problem then of inertia on the part of the civil service. So in order to counteract that, there was this sort of huge attempt made to reform the civil service, in part by the creation of agencies, right? But the creation of those agencies, like, inevitably increased the autonomy of civil servants, right? So you can't promote risk taking in the civil service without also then giving people a lot more latitude, including a lot more latitude for failure. So there was something almost like inherently contradictory in between the political motivation for the creation of a lot of these agencies and then what they wound up doing in terms of the institutional structures that were created. But obviously that entire process of, first of all, like, corporatization of crown corporations, but then also of hiving off administrative agencies from line departments, wound up then further, like, I don't want to say exacerbating the problem, but like posing the question in a more dramatic way of how it is that the people who are being put in these positions of power then are making decisions about how to pursue the public interest. I mean, I suppose, like, there was with new public management, the theory that you could control all this with contracting. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the most obvious Canadian examples of new public management thinking and what they call in the UK next steps agencies is the CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, which is an autonomous unit responsible through the Minister for Public Safety, I think. But the ArriveCan fiasco, the contracting fiasco there, is a testament to that, not necessarily being an answer to these issues.
Yeah, and I mean, so my limitations as a philosopher show up pretty quickly when you start discussing nitty-gritty like this. And so, like, most of what I know about this stuff is from reading Donald Savoy, and not everybody thinks Donald Savoy is right about everything, I suppose. But I do find it compelling the observation just that that a lot of this stuff failed because in order to work properly, obviously, so the idea is to create like a lot more discretion on the part of these agencies and agency heads and how they go about their work. And that's going to create innovation, but it's also going to generate failure. And then the question is, politically, what happens when failures occur? And I think that like Savoy observes, and I believe him, that the general consensus amongst elected officials is that if you go out as a minister and say, oh yeah, that decision wasn't made by me, that decision was made by so-and-so, who's actually, runs this autonomous agency and has the right to make their own mistakes or something like that, right? That politically, that just doesn't work. Like, you can't actually offload the scandal onto it. So when things go well, it's like, oh wow, look at this great autonomous agency is doing such great work. But then when things go badly, it just winds up right back in the minister's lap. And then he claims that this has led to like a huge, like the politicians have therefore responded to the way you would expect, which is they've clawed back a lot of the autonomy that these agencies have, because they know that they wind up getting stuck with the fiasco when it happens, or the scandal or what have you.
Anyone watching Quebec politics at the moment could also tell you that that's another example. You have the automobile insurance entity, which is a crown corporation, is supposedly completely independent of government. It screwed up its new online service system, and there's been significant political fallout that the poor ministers are dealing with. I see lots of questions in the Q&A, but I want to continue to abuse my my position just to give an example, maybe, which is in the nitty-gritty, and I don't expect a detailed response necessarily, but just to kind of think of the implications of your framework for the way we think about administrative agencies. If I take the CRTC, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, as an example, it is responsible for the Canadian broadcasting policy, which is set out in Section 3 of the Broadcasting Act. And that has 40 subsections or subparagraphs, 40. And so the CRTC is charged with figuring out what this collection of objectives means in any particular circumstance. And I guess I had always thought that the CRTC had democratic legitimacy in the sense that it is doing something that Parliament has asked it to do. Parliament has set out this policy, it's given the CRTC a mandate, and off you go, CRTC, and do that. And the legitimacy of the CRTC resides in the chain back up to Parliament. But you're saying that that is too simplistic and even wrong, and that really the basis of legitimacy when you're exercising discretion under a statute like that, it lies in these three principles that you have on the screen: commitment to efficiency, equality, and liberty. Am I right about that? Is that a fair example?
So I think it's fair. I just want to say that I think in terms of how, I mean, so how to relate, I mean, when you relate this to the whole thing about output legitimacy, like, so I don't think that the public is evaluating the performance of the state using these kinds of principles. So I think that these principles constitute, like, at the higher levels, the way in which people are guiding their decision making. I think the CRTC is kind of a tricky case, because media and communications are an unusual kind of area. So that is, it's not a standard market, and it impinges on the democratic public sphere in complicated ways. So that's a particularly difficult case. But to relate to my three principles. But in terms of the sort of Rothstein framework of input legitimacy versus output legitimacy, I think that you can see clearly in the case of the CRTC that it benefits a lot in terms of its legitimacy. Like, so a lot of what the CRTC does seems kind of wild to me if you evaluate it from kind of first principles of political philosophy. And so you wonder, like, how this agency is able to exercise this power without somebody reining it in. And it seems to be part of the answer is that it in terms of its performance. And so I think the CRTC actually got significant output legitimacy from not allowing the situation to develop in Canada that you see in the United States with Fox News, right? So, like, that is, so in the United States, you had the abolition of the fairness doctrine, which was also maintained by their broadcasting authority. And then you had, I think what a lot of people would you could say in a politically nonpartisan way, but you had significant degeneration of the media space with the development of talk radio and Fox News. So in Canada, you had an initiative with the Sun News Network to create something rather similar, and that was essentially blocked by the CRTC. I actually think that so I don't want to be kind of a naked consequentialist about it, but I think that was an example of a performance where the CRTC kind of protected the media space from a certain kind of market strategy that people found, a certain segment of the population found attractive. But that was able to actually then regulate it in a way that preserves something more like civil discourse within the country. So I think, like, the fact that they've done a reasonable job of protecting that discursive space generated a certain amount of output legitimacy for them, right? So that was, like, now 15 years ago, but, like, so in terms of its current difficulties in dealing with, like, the collapse of legacy media and social media and so on, like, all that is sort of, like, remains to be seen. But I think that the episode with Sun and the comparison to Fox in the United States is, like, a good example, though, of the CRTC like, generating output legitimacy for itself by actually generating outcomes that people then, broadly speaking, approved of.
Thank you, Professor Heath. In the Q&A, a couple of questions which kind of follow from
I should
from
mention
this theme.
I'm, like, terrible at multitasking, so I can't read a chat and talk. So if you
that's fine. I'm not sure I'm any much better at multitasking, but I can certainly read you the questions. And there are two here which I would group together, and it's they'll take you to a fundamental point you make about how discretion is exercised, I think. So Ephraim Barrera asks, or it's a statement followed by a question. The normative justification of the civil service seems in large part to rest on the quality of the normative discretion they exercise. Given that some administrative or policy entrepreneurship decisions by the civil service will go beyond simply limiting the legislature to proposing or encouraging policies thought to be in the public interest, are liberal principles, understood as a set of constraints, sufficient for good normative discretion? In other words, do you think that the culture, in scare quotes, of the civil service needs to be informed by more substantive ethical principles to cultivate normatively excellent discretion? There's another question from David Jabinski, which is shorter. It gets, I think, at a similar, or maybe the same thing. He asks, what are the principles guiding a bureaucrat's liberal actions in checking democratic power, equivalent to constitutional rights or the common law that the courts would apply?
Okay, I'm going to come back to the second one because I didn't quite catch it. The first one, though, yeah, so I blasted through a little bit quickly the way I'm understanding these principles of modern liberalism, but it's important to emphasize that they're not merely constraints, or that they're not the sort of negative liberties in the sort of the way classic individual rights are. So yeah, I didn't want to suggest that it's just a counter-majoritarian check. And so there's a large discussion in the book about efficiency, where I argue that a huge amount of the construction of the modern welfare state is actually all just motivated by an attempt to correct various forms of market failure, and therefore is guided by this norm of Pareto efficiency. And it's important to recognize that Pareto efficiency is not like a negative constraint, right? It represents a kind of affirmative commitment to solving certain kinds of social problems. Right. So if you look at, so an example I often use in this is like the planning department in the city of Toronto, because like unlike a lot of Canadian cities, like Toronto doesn't have a lot of natural assets. So to the extent that Toronto functions at all, it's because it has a better planning department than or has a better capacity. I mean, between the province and the city, has a better capacity to engage in urban planning than most other jurisdictions in Canada. So it has a good planning department. As the planning department goes about their business, largely independent of like what's going on with the mayor and city council, et cetera, et cetera. Like they have a very independent conception of how they see the city. So for example, like if you look at transportation policy, right? So the planning department of the city of Toronto has to look at the fact that, 500,000 people pre-pandemic, travel from the outskirts of Toronto to the downtown every day for work, right? And so how do you move 500,000 people every day in and out of the city? And so the attempt to get all those people to get downtown generates collective action problems, which manifests itself most obviously in the form of traffic congestion, right? And so the planning department regards congestion as a problem and then tries to figure out what to do about it, and engages in a wide range of strategies and also long-term planning to think about these things, right? And a lot of what they do is just is sort of independent of what's going on in the democratic political sphere. So at the time that, again, this is a lot of my thoughts on this were formed while Rob Ford was mayor of Toronto. And he, one of the things that he had campaigned on was a desire to end what he called the war on the car that was going on in the city of Toronto. And that he got enormous amount of public support in the outer suburbs and stuff like that, because people who drive their cars are very frustrated, right? And so end the war on the car was the big slogan. But then, a year into his mayoralty, right in the middle of campus at University of Toronto, all these lanes of traffic got removed and got replaced by bike lanes. And the street signs and the lights all got changed to have new bike signals and all this kind of stuff, right? And I'm like, does the mayor know this is happening? Right? That is the whole sort of planning machine just kind of continued on its own. And all these bike paths got put in, despite the fact that the mayor had just been elected on a platform of ripping all this stuff out, right? So then the question is, who's doing this stuff, right? Like who's putting all these bike lanes in? And the answer is, well, really the planning department's doing it. I mean, so maybe that's not the best example, but it is a good example of the way in which there's this whole machinery in the background that operates, it's obviously affected by what happens in elections, but it's not determined by what happens in elections. So, but then what's guiding the planning department? And so the worrisome, if you wanted to characterize it in a negative way, you'd say it's a whole bunch of nanny-ish urban elites who have a very particular view about how they want people to live, right? So they want everyone to be crammed into high-rise apartments and to have no fresh air. and to live in and to travel on trains so that the government can control them, et cetera, et cetera. It's very easy to characterize it as being just a lifestyle preference that certain kinds of urbanites have that they're trying to coercively impose upon the rest of the population. Right? So that would be the negative characterization, right? So what I'm trying to do is to say, well, sometimes it is that, right? But sometimes it's not. And so the way to characterize it in a way that would be less negative would be to say that, look, like obviously people in an urban environment disagree radically about a lot of different questions in life, like how they want to live, right? Whether they need a backyard, whether they want to, like how they want to travel and how often they want to travel. I mean, so you'd have to be dumb not to recognize that an urban environment has a lot of pluralism with respect to these life choices. And therefore, the attempt to impose one of those views on everyone is guaranteed to fail, right? But that having been said, as we each go about our lives trying to pursue these different projects we get stuck in collective action problems, right? Where I'm doing something that's wrecking things for you and you're doing something that wrecks things for me. And that we can try to solve that problem without necessarily having to agree about the first order question about how to live our lives. Right? There's a collective action problem. And the principle of efficiency is really about solving those kinds of collective action problems, right? So traffic congestion doesn't coincide with anyone's view of the good life, right? It's not like some people love congestion and other people don't, and it's just a disagreement, right? It's rather people interfering with each other in a really counterproductive way. So the planning department, right, to the extent that it's like governed by a liberal conception of efficiency, can target these cases where we actually are interfering with each other in this unproductive way, and then try to think, creatively about ways to solve this, right? So efficiency is a very forward-looking and constructive approach, not merely a kind of negative constraint on what democratic majorities do.
And I think that disposes of the second question as well, which is, to repeat, it was what are the principles guiding a bureaucrat's actions in checking democratic power, equivalent to constitutional rights or common law? In your framework, the principles are not really constraints in the way that in the way courts would impose constraints. And you do have a very good chapter on administrative discretion and the rule of law, where you discuss how administrative law can impose some checks on the executive, but equally emphasizing that it's important for the executive branch to internalize rule of law norms in order to win legitimacy for their actions.
Yeah, if I could just say something quick on that, which is that so the way I'm thinking about this, the Convention of Civil Service Neutrality structures all of this in an unprincipled way, which means that there's a kind of, you can think of there being a robust liberal commitment, like a robust normative liberalism of the kind that, say, Rawls articulated, which is going to have a commitment to not only Pareto efficiency, but also a kind of like full-blooded conception of equality that's going to require a certain level of material equality and so forth, right? And then individual autonomy and liberty. And so in one's own private political convictions, one could be committed to that kind of robust liberalism. The civil service, however, is constrained, right? So, like in general, the state, is committed to that, but there are aspects of it that are more or less politically controversial. And so the civil service also needs to avoid taking positions that that would show up as being obviously partisan, in order to preserve the traditional bargain with elected officials that allows them to provide a certain kind of neutral expertise. And the question then of what the civil service can do and can't do without violating political neutrality is not going to get answered by first principles. It's going to be in part a function of the political culture of the society. So the answer in Canada is going to be different from the answer in a lot of other different countries. And so what I think that when it comes to efficiency, there's a really, really broad center in Canadian politics of political parties and political actors who all endorse essentially a commitment to Pareto efficiency. So in other words, the center is really big in Canadian politics. So the number of, for example, egalitarians who are willing to level down, right, which is to like prioritize equality over efficiency, is relatively small. And the number of genuine libertarians who are willing to sacrifice efficiency for individual liberty is also relatively small. So there's a really broad center, which means that the civil service can commit itself fairly robustly to a principle of efficiency without stepping on anyone's toes politically while maintaining neutrality. However, when it comes to equality, equality is intrinsically more controversial than efficiency because it deals with questions of distribution and therefore automatically generates winners and losers. Right? So it's always going to be politically contested. And as a result, if you look at political ideological debates in Canada, differences amongst political parties, right, you actually do get significant division. I mean, so within the broad center, you get significant differences of opinion about questions of equality. And therefore, the civil service has to be a great deal more circumspect when advancing a broadly speaking egalitarian agenda, right? So the civil service cannot pursue, right, particular conceptions of, say, material equality, right? Like what's a permissible level of income inequality is not a question on which the civil service can have a view. Why? Because that's so obviously in the domain of political contestation and therefore needs to be resolved democratically. Right. And so with respect to equality, I argue that the civil service has to take a much more minimalist position because otherwise it would wind up intruding on political questions that should be decided democratically. So the reason I focus on the rule of law, understood in this kind of modern way, is that I think that the rule of law, if you scratch the surface, represents a kind of minimal egalitarianism, that all citizens are equal and therefore have to be treated equally. And so that one way to read kind of modern, like not classical liberal, but kind of Fuller style conceptions of the rule of law is as a sort of minimalist notion of citizen equality. Right. So the civil service, so the rule of law stuff winds up being the way in which the civil service advances its conception of equality. But that's not derived from any kind of principled like way of thinking about equality. It's just like what you can do without violating political neutrality.
Would it be fair to say that you think cost-benefit analysis is a means of achieving equality in some ways, a means of kind of sanding out rough edges?
Sort of, but basically no. In that a lot of what I'm trying to do, there's a huge chapter in the book about cost-benefit analysis, but the major goal of that chapter is to argue that cost-benefit analysis, like the core mechanism of cost-benefit analysis, is actually motivated by just the commitment to Pareto efficiency, not by a commitment to utilitarianism. And so in the literature, a lot of the prominent defenders of cost-benefit analysis are utilitarians in their sort of comprehensive moral and political view. And they regard cost-benefit analysis as kind of an approximation of the utilitarian gold standard, right? So someone like Cass Sunstein is basically a weak consequentialist, as he puts it, like he's a kind of utilitarian. And so he likes cost-benefit analysis because it's like an operationalization of utilitarianism. Someone like Matthew Adler, who offers like a much more principled and detailed articulation, is like a flat-out utilitarian, and therefore endorses cost-benefit analysis as the best approximation. So I think that that's an unfortunate view, because utilitarianism involves a commitment to both a conception of efficiency that's relatively unproblematic, namely that you should maximize, but it also involves a wildly controversial commitment to equality, which says that equality doesn't matter at all, right? So that is, utilitarianism is committed to distributive neutrality, which says that happiness counts for the same regardless of who gets it, which means that you can take happiness away from some people and give it to other people, right? And it doesn't matter who gets it, right? So that's a kind of actually anti-egalitarianism that's extremely controversial. So most political philosophers reject utilitarianism because they reject the view of equality that's implicit in utilitarianism. And then they reject cost-benefit analysis because they believe people like Sunstein and Adler, who claim that cost-benefit analysis is just an approximation or an operationalization of utilitarianism. So they say, well, I'm not a utilitarian, therefore I reject cost-benefit analysis. And so a lot of the labor in that chapter is to show that the controversial egalitarian or anti-egalitarian commitment of utilitarianism is inessential to the procedure of cost-benefit analysis. That you could do cost-benefit analysis focusing just on the efficiency idea, right? And then supplement it with whatever views you happen to have about equality, right? So that it's neutral in that egalitarian space, right? So you can combine cost-benefit analysis with, with a more egalitarian view. All right, so that was sort of what the labors of that chapter are an attempt to show, that a lot of cost benefit analysis is just an attempt to figure out if there's a market failure.
Good. And market failure being, as you say, as you suggest, market failure being the real reason we have an administrative state. So a couple more questions there. So one from Ushnis Sengupta is, are algorithms and automation limiting the individual power and discretion individual civil servants have, and centralizing power in one, management, or two, in technology vendors? I guess this is related to that issue about how you try, how one might try to constrain the discretion of officials within the civil service. It's one which is on many people's minds at the moment, of course.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right now, I would say no. But the interesting question is whether or not in the future you can expect that. I guess, I mean, so the first thing I want to say is that, you know, I like tech. I mean, I'm sort of happy that I don't have to deal with problems of technology in the public sector, because the public sector is hugely handicapped when it comes to the implementation of technology, for both good reasons and bad reasons. And therefore, the public sector is always going to be way, way, way behind the private sector when it comes to adoption of technology. You know, so part of that has to do with procurement and procurement rules, which are a nightmare and a whole fascinating sub area of studies in administration. There's really, like, as far as I can see, like no government that's figured out how to do procurement well. But you know, we have enormous difficulties with procurement in Canada, even with respect to, I mean, we have catastrophic difficulties with respect to military procurement and stuff like that. Like even buying stuff that you can weigh, like military hardware, is pretty quantifiable. And it's pretty easy to specify what it is you want, right? But even then, we can't do it properly. I mean, so, you know, despite the efforts of my colleague Anita Anand, failed to solve the procurement problem once and for all. So procurement is difficult. My understanding is procurement in the area of technology is even more difficult, because it's enormously difficult to specify what it is that you want. And so the government exposes itself to an enormous amount of sort of like runaround and bullshit when it tries to do technology procurement. And there have been a huge number of scandals around attempts to do technology procurement. So, you know, so there's all kinds of, you know, runarounds of trying to outsource things to consultants so that they can get around government procurement rules and this kind of stuff, right? So there's a whole nightmare around procurement in technology in the public sector. And so that's the outsourcing of it. And then the in-housing of it has its own problems. And a lot of it is that if you've got, you know, whatever the skills to do fancy AI work, you know, are you going to work for the government, right? I mean, you'd be giving up huge amounts of salary, not working for the private sector. So the state is not able to attract people competitively. And in part because in the area of technology, equity shares play a huge role in people's compensation, right? And so the government's inability to offer equity as compensation is, again, I mean, in all areas is a handicap on its ability to attract talent to the civil service. But in the area of technology, it's particularly handicapping, simply because equity shares and stock options and so on feature so prominently in people's compensation. So that's a structural feature of the public sector that makes it so that they're never, I mean, not to, you know, be rude about people who work, you know, in IT for the government, but they're not the cream of the crop, right? So the public sector is always gonna lag when it comes to these things. So, you know, whatever. So that's why I wouldn't be worried about it in the short term. In terms of controlling discretion, I mean, you could absolutely see a circumstance, though, in which certain types of discretionary decision making would be suspended, or, like, you know, would no longer need to be made by persons. You know, and because AI systems would be able to, you know, more flexibly respond, and in other words, would be able to crowd out individual discretion. And so you could totally see a future in which those applications would develop. So the only thing I would say about that is just that there is this you can see this more prominently in the United States than in Canada, but there is a kind of abhorrence or fear of discretion on the part of state officials that is sort of like nonpartisan, right, or transcends political ideology. And so, I mean, one of my axioms. So I'm in New York right now. I spend a fair bit of time in the United States. So one of the things I've learned spending time in the United States is that everything that's hugely wrong with American society is actually wrong because it's supported by both left and right. Right. That is that both. I mean, so that everything's, you know, there's a whole bunch of complex equilibria, but those equilibria are often sustained by both liberals and conservatives, who often don't realize the extent to which they're contributing to the equilibrium. Right. So a huge number of problems with the state in the United States come from the fact that both left and right have this visceral horror at the thought of discretion. And they have it for different reasons. Conservatives in the United States hate discretion because they don't want state officials to have that kind of power, whereas liberals have an abhorrence at discretion because they're convinced that everyone's a racist, right? And they think that the lower you go down in an organizational hierarchy, the more racist people become. And so granting state officials discretion is just going to give them license to be racist. And so both the Democrats and the Republicans do everything possible to constrain administrative discretion. Which then generates a huge number of pathologies in American public administration. And one of them is just the well-known phenomenon of, you know, rather than having a binder full of rules, they have like a filing cabinet full of rules to deal with like even something simple in the domain of regulation, inspection, and stuff like that, right? So they have this huge problem of just overwhelming public officials with rules, which then typically increases discretion rather than reducing it. And so then they create meta rules to constrain the application of rules and stuff, right? So the United States government is a kind of example of the nightmare that can arise when one attempts to eliminate the discretion of the public servant. And so in Canada, you have less of that problem simply because you have a great deal more deference to state authority. And so people are simply not as upset about discretionary exercises of state power. And as a result, you have an environment in which there's in many ways more efficient public administration because public officials are not constrained by a huge volume of rules intended to limit their discretion. And so I think it's like really, really important that we sort of become aware of the fact that in well-functioning welfare state, and then like everyone loves Sweden, right? Everyone loves the Scandinavian countries, right? But you go to Sweden, right? And state officials, I mean, it's outrageously discretionary. Right? I mean, it's even shocking from a Canadian standpoint how discretionary the exercise of public authority is in a country like Sweden, whether it's factory inspection or whether it's the welfare bureaucracy or whatever, right? It's like hugely, hugely discretionary in ways that I think would make Americans go crazy, but would make even Canadians uncomfortable, right? And so if you look at well-functioning, successful welfare states, they're highly, highly discretionary. And so rather than regarding discretion as a bad thing, I mean, obviously the abuse of discretion is a bad thing. Right? But you can't seriously be a defender and a proponent of the welfare state and think that discretion is something that needs to be eliminated. Right? So while I think that you might be able to solve certain kinds of problems, like piling rules onto public officials does not actually reduce discretion. Right? Maybe AI and algorithms could reduce discretion. But before that, I think if that's the prior question of whether it's actually such a bad thing, having public officials exercising discretionary power. And there, I want to say really emphatically that it's often not a bad thing, as long as they maintain an adequate commitment to the public interest, right? So that they're not abusing the discretion, then it's better to have discretion in many circumstances.
One last question for you, if we may, Professor Heath. There's someone's asking if you have ever worked in the public service and in what capacity. Curious about that. And this person also observes that a reason why work continues during elections is that 90% of what the public service does is outlined in legislation, and the elected officials or ministers have very little influence on anything. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Oh, yeah. So I guess I find the question a little confusing in that. So first of all, no, I haven't. I should say that that's one of the challenges in doing this kind of work, specifically in a parliamentary system, Is that it's difficult actually to figure out how the civil service works. I mean, other than, I've worked my entire life in the public sector, but that as in a university, so that's kind of cheating, right? So it's not really in the civil service, even though all my emails are subject to freedom of information requests. I certainly have never worked as a civil servant. But one of the aspects of the so-called traditional bargain that allows civil service neutrality to persevere as an institution is this sort of extraordinary discretion that civil servants have when it comes to talking about their work, right? So secrecy is kind of like a second nature to people in the public service, and that's important. It's related to the nonpartisan aspect of our civil service, but it actually makes it incredibly difficult for people like political philosophers to think about the public service because who knows how anything works, right? And no one's talking to you. And so if you want to figure out how judges are reasoning, you can read, their decisions. Whereas with civil service, it can be extraordinarily difficult. And so I to the extent that, I sort of want to don't want to pretend to be an expert on this stuff at all, right? I've only ever had the opportunity to be a fly on the wall and then to talk to, all of the retired civil servants that I work with at the School of Public Policy. But in terms of the second part of the question, that's why I was a little bit confused by the relationship between the first question and the second, which is that as far as the second, that was kind of my point, is that public officials, elected officials and ministers have way less power than people are than the popular perception, but also even the academic perception is. And so, the state is this giant machine that kind of runs on its own principles, right? And you're right, some of that is based on past statutory enablement, right? But that's sort of what I want to draw attention to and emphasize is the extent to which all these bureaucrats who are going to work every day are, you cannot plausibly be construed as kind of following orders from an elected official. Right? And so that's the whole problem of administrative power, right? Is to say, well, then, when decisions have to get made, right? And asking the minister is not the correct answer to the question of how these decisions get made, right? Well, then how do they get made, right? And that's what I think is the really interesting normative question, is to try to figure out how civil servants are making those decisions.
I said that was the last question, but in fact I missed.
It doesn't
one.
have to be. I'm
I do have to go off and try to teach administrative law and how to at least not violate those constraints on discretion. So my colleague John Mark Keyes thanks you for a very provocative, thought-provoking discussion, and asks what explains why some issues attract the attention of politicians and others don't. What triggers a politician to take direct interest in a particular issue or how a particular problem is being addressed in the civil service? He also asked whether social media might have affected this.
Well, that's a great question, and I mean, because I have this sort of pet theory, so I'll just end with a provocative observation, right? Which is, I actually think politicians have gotten way less interested in governing over the course of my lifetime, and in part because they've gotten better at their jobs, right? And their jobs, to a certain extent, are getting elected. And so I think one of the most sort of negative, I mean, a really sort of unfortunate discovery, which is a consequence of more sophisticated polling in part, and better sort of electoral strategy, and better sort of quantitative analysis amongst politicians, is the extent to which kind of broad issues don't actually move voters. So this is the famous discovery of the wedge issue. So that, I mean, newspapers sometimes still make this mistake where they'll publish a poll that says, going into the election, what are the 3 most important issues to Canadians, right? And then they'll say, oh, number 1, the economy, number 2, the healthcare system, blah, 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 right? And then from that, you would expect, oh, well, then therefore the big debate is going to be about these issues, which are the most important ones that affect Canadians, right? But there's a failure to realize what politicians all know, which is that there's no votes to be had, right, on the economy and healthcare, because voters, median voters don't perceive a difference between the parties in the management of those issues. So nobody other than say academics and intellectuals, nobody votes for party A over party B because of how they feel about the healthcare system, right? And so what the big surprise, say 20 years ago, in this polling research was that there's surprisingly few issues that actually move votes, and that those votes tend to be very small and very symbolic. So my colleague, now boss Peter Lowen, has done sort of amazing research on this with the vote compass data and stuff like that, showing that, so an issue like, so why does the Minister of Health spend so much time, well, not now, right? But like think of when Rona Ambrose was Minister of Health, the amount of time she spent talking about safe injection sites, right? So, you're talking about the healthcare system in Canada. What are the major issues? Well, if you looked at the communications coming out of the minister's office at the time, you would think that safe injection sites was the single most pressing healthcare problem in the country. Not wait times, not whatever, right? Why? Well, because of all of the polling research that shows that safe injection sites are actually polarizing. It's a classic wedge issue, right? That is, people will actually change their votes based on what the government's policy is with respect to safe injection sites. Whereas with reducing wait times, apart from the fact that it takes 10 years to even make a dent on that, there's also no votes to be had on that, right? War in Afghanistan, at the time actually moved votes, right? So you had a huge concentration of debate around that, right? But not about submarines and helicopters and whatever, right? So politicians have gotten way more focused, but what they've discovered is a lot of these big governance issues don't actually help them get reelected. And a lot of these seemingly trivial issues that are polarizing actually do help them get elected. And so I think that there's been a shift in the interest of politicians towards what they're being told is actually affecting their electoral chances. And as a result, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have gotten way less interested in day-to-day governance. And that has actually dramatically increased the power and the discretion of the civil service, because the minister, cares less about what's going on in the department. That could be true, could be false. This is my provocative suggestion, right? Is from the outside, it seems to me that ministers have gotten a lot less interested in a lot of this day-to-day stuff.
Well, thank you, Professor Heath, for that provocative observation to close. As I say, the book, The Machinery of Government, Public Administration and the Liberal State is interesting and provocative throughout, and it's been a real pleasure to have you with us at the Administrative Law and Governance Colloquium. So thank you. We'll be back next week with Professor Robert Thomas from the University of Manchester to talk about immigration enforcement. But for today, it remains only for me to say thank you again to Professor Joseph Heath for a wonderful, engaging discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot. And thanks
all
for
the best.